Paul Brandis, and this is episode 1 of the theFormed.life podcast, where we hope to challenge you in thinking deeply about what it means to follow Jesus on Monday. That is to say, in all of life. In today's episode of the podcast, we are going to talk about the hostile dividing walls that tragically still exist between people. And we're going to take a special focus on race, ethnicity, and culture, which is a big topic. We will not be able to cover it all. Certainly not. We're definitely not going to solve it. But our big idea today is the idea that one of the tools that Jesus uses to tear down hostile dividing walls is genuine relationships. Here with me today to help me unpack that idea is Christian Fellowship Baptist's Senior Pastor, Stan Archie, as well as Christ Community Church's lead Senior Pastor, Tom Nelson. Stan, Tom, thank you both for making the time for being here with me today.
Looking forward to it.
Me too.
Yeah. Let's start here. The current conversation that I've observed taking place in our broader culture about racial and ethnic differences is often not life-giving or especially productive. Can I say that? But I got two pastors and I'm a pastor. I want to focus a little more specifically on the church today. So what are you seeing in how the church is engaging in these conversations, knowing, we know this, right? We lead in these spaces, that of course there's both health and unhealth in the church related to these conversations, but I'm wondering what you're seeing. So Stan, we'll start with you.
Well, one of the things I am seeing that is unhealthy, I'll start with that, is the illusion that there's not a problem. It is when churches take on the position that that's not an issue we need to deal with, or they take on an issue as if it's a cultural issue and not a spiritual issue. Which would mean that the positive things that I see is just the opposite of that. When people come to the conclusion that the blood of Christ relates us at a stronger level than any other identity, then that means that your success is my success and your struggle is my struggle. And the external or physical or even social elements do not divide us because we are together in the unity of Christ. And that means that you'll take a real look at my pain. I'll take a real look at yours. You'll take a real look at my glorious pleasures and struggles, and I'll take a real look at yours. Yeah. Right now in America, because we have culturalized ourselves to sort of, and I'll use the term whitewash, but I use it with my own definition and not the traditional definition. That means we have really tried to discolor the history of America as it relates to what we really need to do to be unified. We have a past that haunts us, and in the Christian circles, we have to recognize that Christ is that life-giving element that gives us a space of redemption, not redemption as one apologizing for what takes place, but redemption from our carnality that causes us to be divided to a unity that causes us to be collective in Christ.
I love that, and especially that idea of looking really honestly at both the pain and pleasure of everyone that we have the privilege of meeting. That reminds me of Galatians 6:2, right? We are called in that verse by the Apostle Paul to bear one another's burdens, and as we do so, we fulfill the law of Christ, which is love. So Tom, how are you seeing some of those dynamics play out, or what have you noticed, again, both healthy, unhealthy, as in terms of how the church engages in these moments?
Yeah, and thank you, Stan, for articulating so well. I think my conversations with many churches and leaders around the country is, I think the tendency sometimes, and I think this is unhealthy, so I guess I'll go there first, but is to think about racial walls or ethnic kind of barriers through a very simple lens. And actually, it's a multifaceted one. And I think that's what I try to, on the positive side, is to help people see that history matters. Some people say history doesn't matter, let's just focus on the present. So understand historical wounds and history. But also, there's a personal brokenness that misshapes this conversation and love, right? Disorders our love. But there's also systemic and structural brokenness. And some people want to focus on that only or not. That's not an issue. And then I think what's really important also, and Paul talks about this in Ephesians, he talks about the new family and the barrier walls coming down. It's like there's a demonic element And as spiritual people, we understand that all these factors are in play in a complex history and deep woundedness. So that's what I guess when I look at the church broadly is I find people kind of in camps or polarized, like, hey, it's a personal responsibility issue, you got to get this all together, or the family's broken down. And there's truth to that, right? A personal responsibility. There's also structural barriers and history. And there's also a demonic. And we shouldn't forget that, right? Jesus said the thief comes to kill, steal, that's injustice, steal and destroy, but I've come to give you life. So I think that's what my concern is, that we would look through it biblically, but not just one facet of the lens, but the multifaceted lens will help bring redemption and love back into play.
Well, and I love you bringing in Ephesians, because we're actually teaching that in both of our churches right now. And so it's been this sweet collaboration to preach that across our 5 campuses at Christ Community. But Stan, I know at Christian Fellowship, you're also in Ephesians, and that's really where we're drawing this phrase, hostile dividing walls, from Ephesians chapter 2. Paul talks about how Christ has destroyed those dividing walls. And when we taught that text a few weeks ago, I anchored in the idea, or really the question, if Christ tore down the hostile dividing wall, why do we keep building it back up? Why do we keep building it back up? And one of the ways that we can not build it back up and in fact move across what once was a hostile dividing wall is our big idea today, which is that genuine relationships is a tool that Jesus uses to break down those dividing walls. And then, hey, we were divided in this wall, but now we're moving towards one another. We're moving together in relationship. And I think genuine relationship, deep, abiding relationships. And when I look at the two of you, I see that. And so that's really what I'm most interested to talk about, honestly, is what has this relationship looked like over the years? And I actually don't know this story. I've known both of you for years, but I don't know the story of how you guys met. So I'm just interested in that. And so Stan, why don't you start? How did you and Tom meet?
Well, and let me say something in transition. Ephesians 2 introduces to us at the beginning a condition that I think we are unaware of. We have so normalized carnal humanity that we don't recognize how deficient we are. And he's pointing out how deficient we are. He says, you were like this, and we were like this too. And this is the change that's taking place. So you have a new identity, you need to grow into it. At the time Tom and I met, the cultural divide was as it is now, but there weren't as many weapons that people could hide behind to be really hostile with each other. So we had better skills of conflict resolution because we were more social. We didn't have the Facebook to hide behind. We didn't have internet to hide behind. So whatever I had to say to Tom, I had to say it to him, to his face, which means I had to develop a set of social skills that were acceptable in that conversation. Right now, I would just post something. And I might even post it directly to him. I just post something. and so that hostility is there, and it creates a wall. We have tools that create walls and keep them up. So we have been in, as a church, have been in a couple of relationships. So the Promise Keepers movement had come along and really promote.
Which is like mid-90s, right? Even earlier.
It was kind of early to that. It was like early 90s, maybe.
Early 90s, okay, yep.
It was like 25 years.
Trying to set the scene, trying to set the scene.
It was really like 25 years. It was,
We're kind of the old guys now.
Right, yeah.
Sure.
And so we were, a gentleman from Christ Community had come to the area where we live and where we serve, and he was teaching young kids rugby.
This was Charles Usher, our British friend.
Yeah, he was teaching rugby.
Who's a part of our downtown campus still. So.
Is he? I didn't know he was part of this campus. Yeah. So so the kids would come. So we were tutoring the same kids. So the kids would come in and they would say, well, Coach came by and we have a rugby game, and they would invite me to these rugby games. I didn't know what rugby was. So I was like, rugby? Who? And who is Coach? So I'm going to their parents, and even the parents knew Coach. And, and the kids would imitate him every now and then, and they would say things with the English accent. And so I finally asked, it just never dawned on me. I just thought he was a black guy in my mind. So it dawned on me, I said, well, is he white or black? And they said, no, he's white. I said, you mean a white guy's coming down here, working with you guys, teaching you guys a game that we've never heard of before. And so I wanted to meet him. And so I met with him and said, listen, we're working with the same kids. And at that particular point, race wasn't an issue. His love for our kids was what attracted me to this thing. And so we had a few conversations. And if you know Charles Usher, he's not short of things to say, things to do, or ambition. So, Charles was like, man, we can teach every urban kid in Kansas City rugby, and we can do, and so I said, so tell me where you go to church. And so he was, I think he was an elder at the time, going to Christ Community. And then he set up a meeting for us to sit down and have a conversation. And my first statement was, listen, I'm not real positive about this because white folks have pulled us to the table as their token to have a service with us, to tell everybody else that they know a black person, have a black friend. And we went through this whole Promise Keepers thing. And I don't think that's keeping a promise. So I said, we got to decide whether we're going to have periodic dates, whether we're going to be engaged and start thinking about the future, or whether we're planning for marriage. So but I don't want to have one impression. You're dating me, and I'm thinking we're going to get married.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the introduction that took place at the table.
Wow. That's amazing. Tom, I'd love to hear kind of your side of that, or what you remember about those probably conversations with Charles, or just that first meeting that Stan's describing. Yeah.
Well, what came out of it from our angle, and again, we've often wondered like how our churches were formed almost at the same time. Like God had already planned this kind of relationship. But at Christ Community, our background in the very beginning is that we had a heart for the whole city. We had no idea what role we would play, but we were very open. And I think Charles really embodied that. Like, how can we be a part of the whole city? What God's kingdom agenda here is a whole city. And again, that was the backdrop that I think was so vital for Charles being that bridge, specifically to Christian fellowship, because we'd had other friendships, initial friendships with other churches, but it was like such a wonderful bridge. He was such a wonderful bridge builder. But the backdrop was that Christ Community from the very beginning saw our mission in a city context, not just our individual location. And again, that framework allowed us the kind of missional alignment. And I think we had this sense of humble engagement and teachability, like, how do we do this together? We can't do this alone. Yeah. And I think that helped really connect. And I'll give credit to Stan. Stan was willing to engage with us and give us an opportunity to serve together. It's been an incredible joy over the decades.
Here's what I went back to, I said, look, let me tell y'all something. We have met with and dealt with white people before, but these are real people. I mean, not in spite of the fact that they're white, these are real people. I felt at the end of there, you and Charles and Kevin, I mean, I walked away feeling like I am willing to risk emotional investment in these guys. And that was a comfort level and a safety that I had not felt with any of the other relationships we had. And we had been burnt a few times. So when I went back to the other guys, they were looking at me and saying, do we get into this again? I was like, no, this is different.
It's different.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Well, and Tom, you mentioned, and we kind of drew back some of when the history maybe with Promise Keepers came in. This is not a relationship that has just been a day or two old. This is now decades. Yes. So Christ Community and Christian Fellowship as institutions forming in the 80s.
Very similar time frame.
Right, but then you guys gathering together for some of these early conversations and meetings in the 90s. So over what is now 25 plus years of knowing one another, maybe each of you share one story of joy in the midst of that. And then I know at different points there was maybe misunderstanding or assumptions the reality of any genuine relationship that we have is that there is both joy and sorrow, or joy and sadness, or joy and difficulty, or good things and hard things. And so maybe each of you share kind of a story of each of those in terms of how you think about relationship with each other over the years. So Stan?
I'll start with the hurting issues. I think the discovery that, and it was really both at the Tom level and both at the church level, that there were things that I saw and we shared in the journeys throughout the growth of the church, where I couldn't help. I didn't understand the dynamics of being a white guy in America, of dealing with the things that they had to deal with, and I knew that I didn't know for the first time, and I couldn't help. So I see my friend drowning, and I can't do anything, and that was painful and humbling. And I just remember talking to my wife about how painful it was. Like I didn't expect to be and to feel so helpless. So whenever I see Tom hurting, and some of the hurt is just genuine growth that happens in ministry, but I wanted to fix it, and I couldn't. And I wanted to understand it, and I couldn't fully understand it. I just could sit on the sideline and be with them. Same thing with Christ Community. They went through various growing pains, and just it was painful to not be able to help. On the other side of that, I remember one time when I was serving on the City Plan Commission, and I got a call from I think it was either Tom or Kevin. Or it might have been John, but one of them called me and said, "Look, we're trying to get a property to open up a youth center and do some things for the youth, and I could help because of my position on the road." So I said, "I'm going to use my privilege to step in and help." That was it. Maybe it was my ego or whatever it was, but I could contribute something to Christ Community that I thought was significant. Yeah, that felt really good.
Yeah. Well, I love in kind of both sides of that, Stan. There's like the painful parts are I wanted to help, but for whatever reason I couldn't. And I was able to help because of some places that God had brought me and some ways I'd been gifted and some places I was serving. Both of those have that same centrality of, and in the context of a genuine relationship, that question of how can I help? And maybe the answer is, well, not right now, or you got to sit on the sidelines, which is hard. That is painful.
And I think that I could I think more than anything, I could be trusted. Like they were trusting me to be able to be a part of this journey with them. If I could throw in just a little bit of another piece, I think that just kind of came to mind, and that is the tragedies in the culture. When 9/11 happened, our thought was, so when 9/11 happened and everything shifted in the culture, so, the airports changed, security was high, living your life every day as if you could die was something that was normal for us. We got together, we prayed, sing some songs or whatever, and then one of the ladies, Mother Williams, said, "What about the people at Christ Community? They probably never felt this insecure." And so we got together.
We did.
And the folks from the urban core who says, we live this every day, wanted to really pray and reach out and see how they could really help Christ Community. I mean, those moments where, and they trusted us.
And you pastored us, all of us.
So those are moments that are God moments that I never forget.
Yeah, that's amazing. Tom, what about you? A couple of stories that come to mind as you think about the years. Yeah.
Well, I'm fighting my emotions right now. Just looking at saying, I'm just so grateful for the relationship we've had and the journey. It's such a gift. Such a surprising gift and a good gift. But a couple things, I'll just control my emotions here. It's just a joy to have this time together. I think I'll just say some of the great joys is seeing our congregations, youth retreats, having potluck dinners, building homes together. Wow. I mean, it wasn't forced. It was just, we were a team, on a kingdom agenda for the city. And even neighbors, we thought about neighbors going, what's this? What's this going on? But I would say the other side, the hard part where I just didn't know what Stan and his team would feel is the growing pains. So it's gonna be transparent. And thankfully we had enough relationship where Stan could share his heart with me. But I'm in this process of, we're going from one regional model to multi-campus. And all the different changes that were taking place and still are, right? Like campus pastors and historically we were aligned carefully as a whole church with Christian Fellowship. But because of the multi-campus, each campus has local partners and teammates, and that moved to primarily Brookside for lots of reasons. And it wasn't intentional on my part, but it still was hurtful to Stan. Like, Tom, you're not calling me as much anymore, right? I don't have access. I don't mean that like I'm somebody great, but it's like that shift of structure was a challenge for our long-term relationship. Is that fair to say that? And he felt hurt, and rightly so. And we've tried to work through that. But like, I'm grateful that Stan was honest, because it wasn't, again, there's a lot of hurt we do that's unintentional. Structurally, we were changing and adapting, and yet that was having a negative impact that I wasn't even imagining for Christian fellowship. The relationship, the heart was still there, but the structure had changed, and it had changed our interaction. Is that fair? I mean, that was really hard for you. And once I realized that, I go, yeah, that's a big loss.
Yeah, I think that it's. I do agree. I think that it was from, and you got to kind of get a grasp on. In the beginning, I was there interviewing the interns.
Yeah.
I went up to Truman with the group. We did all our leadership stuff together. We went to summits together. We did everything together. Right. And so the relationship had built, a love relationship had built, and they were like my brothers. I mean, and so then all of a sudden the structure demanded a different setup. Yeah. And I think, and Tom was gracious and loving to sit down and kind of share with me when it was taking place. My first response was related back to my experiences of abandonment, where people were, they're your friend, they're with you, all this kind of stuff. And then boom, when they get an opportunity, they're gone. And I kind of felt that fear. And my first reaction was really to that. And so, so I'm like, here we go again. All the way back to my dad leaving when I was 8. I mean, it just, it just all connects. And then so you start questioning, was it a good idea to love this guy to this much? I mean, am I feeling, is this vulnerability a safe place for me? All those different kinds of things. And Tom was patient and kind of let me get through my whole temper tantrum at first. And then we met a few times and we sat down at Panera's. And then after I started kind of feeling, I'm talking about Tom. I mean, this is like, I know it's not intentional. I know it's part of growing pains. I know all this kind of stuff. So I just had to get past my temper tantrum and recognize that what God has put together, no man can tear asunder. And our friendship has proven that.
And I could have been, this is part of learning and growing, right? I could have been, if I would have been more emotionally in tune to that, because I'm thinking structural mission. I wasn't thinking I was in any way depreciating our friendship. But looking back, I could have anticipated, if I was walking Stan's shoes, like, Tom hasn't called me much later. We're not having this conversation. This is shifting. What does that mean? So I could have done that better. But again, thankfully, we've talked about that we have enough security and friendship that we can smell each other's bad breath and be transparent. Right? That's the language you use. So grateful for that. But that takes a long time to build.
It does, and humility on both parts. And it's interesting for me because I came on staff at Christ Community at our Brookside campus in 2014. And so Christ Community had already moved to this more kind of complex multi-site structure. And you guys have both articulated the joy of that, but then what was hard about that as it related to our sister church relationship with CFBC. I came in 2014 at Brookside, and man, right from that very first summer, it was like, this is amazing. Because I was up there with Brian, and I was meeting, and working on a retreat for all of our campuses and Christian fellowship students for the fall. And I'm like, I don't know churches that do things like this. So it is interesting. Like I kind of come in as, I wasn't aware of any of that history as I am now, and as you guys have just shared in this moment. And it still seemed so good and so healthy to me and so beautiful to me and so different to me, landing at kind of probably at one of the moments where some of that misunderstanding or some of that tension points were at its highest. Even boots on the ground, it was just this really kind of beautiful thing. And I do remember that retreat well. So, but both of you have kind of mentioned this, the individual friendship and relationship over years moved pretty quickly into a formal partnership for the institutions, for the organizations together. And I'm interested in that story. And I've heard you both say, we're really tethered by the fact that our organizations have parallel missions. Now, I've read both our mission statements, or Christ Communities and Christian Fellowships. They're articulated with different words. So what do you both kind of mean by that when you say that that's one of the things that at an institutional and organizational, and then at a congregational level, as our parishioners have gotten to know and engage with one another, how has the sort of parallel missions, how has that helped and really tied together over the years? So,
well, when we first around that table started talking, what I think I articulated then, or at least I felt this, was I don't want to get into a relationship because of racial reconciliation. I think that racial reconciliation has to be a necessity for something bigger to be achieved. Because if you get in for racial reconciliation and then you reconcile, then what?
Then what?
We're done.
If it becomes too hard to reconcile, what keeps pushing you?
Right.
So we start saying, when you guys started, and I think we were 5-6 years into, when you guys started, what was your idea? What did you really want to provide for people? And theirs was direction for the journey. Mm. And we says, okay, yeah, that's kind of the same idea. We want to give direction for the journey, but what we call it is a biblical alternative for living.
Yeah, I love that.
And so, so what we were saying is we recognize that you have a way of living, and all those things that you're doing can be done biblically or unbiblically. But we wanted to say, let's not focus on what you're not doing wrong. Let's focus on what you're not doing right. Mm. And so we want to offer that biblical alternative, that movement towards that direction for the journey. And so it was together. It was the same thing. And when I started looking at all of the sort of principles that followed that, I could take all of those principles and embrace them. And so all of a sudden in my mind, if Christ community doesn't succeed, we cannot succeed because our missions are so intermingled. So even if Tom does have bad breath that day, I got to deal with it because the mission is bigger than my convenience. Mm. And so when all those issues came up in the country that were polarizing, it could not stop us because our mission, kingdom mission, is bigger than whether you're Republican or a Democrat or whether that kind of stuff. And so, and I think we're still on that same mission.
Yes.
It was always interesting to see. I remember when we first started having a conversation about multi-campus, and you guys brought me out, and we were talking about it. And I was actually part of the discussion to part of that taking place. And then we said we won't be, because we looked at it in the same way, but we said we have to expand, but we really won't be building other churches because we see so many churches that it would be a conflict in our culture. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to build impact centers. Yes. So we started building impact centers. So all of those, so our expansion has not been to 5 campuses, has been to 4 impact centers.
Yep. Yeah.
And so, but that mission of a biblical alternative for living that gives people direction for the journey is still something that is a passion in my heart. And I love when I see Christ community achieving our goal, yes. And I assume that they love when we're achieving our goal.
Absolutely. That's incredible. Yeah, that's incredible. Tom, thoughts about that?
Just a couple things on that. One is I think we were both birthed as institutions to love our entire city.
Yes.
And Lord, give us this city. And I think we had a deep commitment to Scripture. Exposition of Scripture. It was just a deep sense that God's Word spoke and that we wanted to speak it, and it was incredibly relevant to bring flourishing to our city. So I think we all had a heart for the city. We know that God doesn't call one church to impact the city. He's got to have a whole group of churches that have different gifts and abilities, but there was a great alignment around mission and around a kingdom agenda. And this city that we love and is broken and has a terribly wounded history, but we want to make a difference. So I think that was it, just entire city. We feel that's our parish, right? Yeah. Not just Troost or not just wherever we are, not just on Brookside. This city is our parish.
Yeah. Well, I love that. And the need for just diverse offerings across the city to reach the whole city. And so I'm hearing a couple things in terms of what has caused the institutional and organizational partnership to be as successful as it has been with challenges along the way. The mission before really anything else, the missional alignment before anything else, and that deeper and more robust tethering it rooted us so deeply so that when the storms of cultural chaos came, as racial and ethnic divides have increased, not just across black and white, but we could weave in all sorts of other stories too of hostile divides. Our institutions had a missional tethering and a missional rootedness that caused us to have ballast. And then I'm hearing really thoughtful ministry contextualization. So God has seen fit for Christ Community to have 5 campuses across the city, but that is a relatively recent development in the last 10 or 15 years of our history, and then has seen fit for Christian Fellowship to be located at 45th and Troost. And I heard, hey, we both expanded over the years, but we did that in different ways because really at the end of the day, right, ministry is about contextualization. So I don't know if I'm capturing those ideas well.
Can I just jump in real quick on this? Because I think I'm a country boy, from Minnesota, small little space, but our little country church in my cultural context, every now and then we had potlucks. And I love that because it's such a picture of, it didn't matter what kind of amount of budget you had, right? Because we had different economic contexts in my little space, but everybody brought their own food and they spread it out, especially July 4th. Yeah. And it was just the most amazing feast. Everybody had their own contribution. And that potluck has been a metaphor to me about how in a city or a context where everybody brings a unique gift to that table. And we've always had, I think, a sense of humble confidence and understanding there's a mutual symbiosis, a mutual contribution. We didn't come together like, I have so much to give you, or you have so much to give me, although you have, in many ways. But I just want to give that metaphor has been so important as we've lived this together. A great sense of humility, I think, for God's glory, a sense of expectation that we are better together. There are different things that come together, but that potluck has just been, when I look back at the decades, I've seen how God has brought such a beautiful potluck together. And I think we started with that framework, right?
And I think I would say this: there's some things we can't take credit for, that we are the positive victims of the work of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
I would say one of them is there was a lot of rooting that God did when we didn't know each other. Like, for example, Nathan's dad was the first theological teacher that embraced the urban core at Calvary Bible College and began to work with us in a small group and teaching.
Wow.
And so I went to Rachel's, his daughter's, which is Bill's wife's, volleyball games when she was a little girl. The need for us to be able to have rebuild homeowning in the community happened at the same time that the ministry started to begin to build habitat. And so it's a whole lot of other things. And I would say this: we didn't come up with a good plan for unity. We were discovering that people had bought onto the vision and began to work things out. So when we got together, it was really comfortably out of control. And the Holy Spirit had started doing stuff that we couldn't have ever thought of in the first place.
Amazing. That's amazing. Well, as I'm thinking about some anticipated questions to this conversation, one of them is, maybe people are hearing the depth of relationship that exists here. And Stan, you're just talking about some other people that are a part of Christ Community's organization, Nathan Miller and his dad, and Bill Gorman and Bill's wife Rachel, and going to her volleyball games when she was growing up. So this depth of relationship. And so maybe people are hearing this and going, gosh, okay, I'm kind of compelled. Genuine relationship with people that are different than me is a tool that Jesus can use to tear down hostile dividing walls. What's a good next step for someone that is compelled and wants to start to do that? If they are looking at their life and they realize that they don't really have what has been described and shared here, what's a good next step for them? So, Tom?
Well, I would start with prayer to say, Lord, teach me, help me to be a more godly apprentice of you. So I would start with prayer, like, Lord, this is where I am. I think you need to do some work in my life. Where do you want to take me? And I would probably also just take the sense of initiative, like where are places and contexts in my workplace, in the city, where I can serve and get to know people who are different than me. I mean, the tendency across the city is sort of this insularity we have in our communities, right? So maybe there's a sense of like, where can I begin to develop a friendship at workplace, with a sister church, with someone that you have maybe a sports league or someone that is ethnically or different than you. So I mean, I think that's where we have to realize that the richness of that God moves us in that direction. If we just stay where we are, we're not going to make progress.
Yeah. Dan, what would you add?
I'm probably going to be a little controversial. But all I have is the truth. The first thing is that you got to come to the conclusion, especially if you're a senior pastor, that the church does not belong to you; it belongs to the kingdom. If it belongs to you, you're only concerned about your gatherings. If it belongs to the kingdoms, you're concerned about God's mission. God's mission has to be bigger than you. If you're limited in the focus of what God is all about, then you expect that God is serving you versus you serving Him. So the question is, who's in this kingdom that God wants me to serve? Yeah. Like you say, the city is our parish, and the team, the folks who serve God, are more than the people who meet at my location. And so that mindset has to come in. The second thing is you got to realize that we have been cultured in America to be segregated. I mean, segregation is not an accident. It's an intentional. It was designed in almost everything we did. It was after Plessy versus Ferguson back in the 1800s, it was the law of the land up until really 54, broke a little bit of it, 1954, but 65, and that's been diminishing now. So, so the culture is not going to come up with that answer. So if you are so sold on your culture, and that brings forth your identity, then it's going to be very difficult for you to be sold on the kingdom also, which gives you a new identity in Christ. So we're blood relatives, but not the blood of your parents, the blood of Christ. And the third and last thing, and probably the most controversial thing is I'm going to say a word. It's not a 4-letter word, but it's just as bad, which is the word privilege. Here's the thing. In America, culturally, sometime in the 1800s, the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court decided that privileges would be uniquely given to whites, and those of African descent would not have privy to the same privilege. Now, when you look at that, you can't look at it as you better than me, that kind of stuff. You got to look at it as the concept. The concept is one group has the power to use that power in a way that gives them advantages, and another group will take away their power so they won't have that advantage. Think of that concept. I think the same thing happens in the kingdom. I think in the kingdom, God has given us individual privileges. Now, in the culture, my privilege is racial privileges. So if I'm in the black community, I have black privilege. If you come to my community, I can give you credibility. All I got to do is say, Paul's a genuine guy, and everybody believes me because I've used my black privilege. I've used the privilege you don't have to give you something you can't get. Okay? In the kingdom, God has pulled us all together. And if you look at Acts, you see that happen. In Acts, they were pulled together from all over the place, all over the culture of Jerusalem. And those who lived in Jerusalem had privileges that everybody else didn't have. So what they said is, you have privileges and insight that you bring to the table. I have privileges that I bring to the table. Let's see what privileges God has given us and ensure that we use those privileges for the kingdom's sake. So if the culture meant it for one thing, God meant it for a different thing. Affirmative action gives me some privileges that Tom's son might not have. However, I can use my privilege to bring him into a space that might be limited because of his race. Now, let's take out the racial thing and keep the privilege idea. The kingdom gives me certain privileges. Yes. Tom and the community of Christ community had organizational privileges. because of how they were, because of whatever the structure was. It could be Presbyterian, I don't know what it was. But they had organizational privileges that we didn't have. So when we united together, now we had some social insight that they didn't have. Mm-hmm. We brought those two things together and we said, what privileges do you have in this area? What do I have in this area? And then we saw it as we're on the same team. So one guy gets rebounds, the other guy can shoot good, but we're on the same team. Tom had this idea to start bringing in great thinkers from all over the world. And we were at the table to discuss who they were going to be, all this kind of stuff. I had no privilege at all to be able to be sitting at the feet of Os Guinness and having a conversation with him or some of the folks that we brought in here. But he utilized his privilege. Now, the question is, how do you get those ideas into the most practical hands of people so they start changing their lives? I had that privilege more. So therefore, you know what I'm saying? I mean, we brought those two things together. So if you really want to move in this direction, you got to be kingdom focused, and the kingdom your church belongs to the kingdom, not to you. The second thing is you have to recognize that our cultural divide is systemically intentional. Like this wasn't a thing this was intentional. And it's not bad. I mean, it's not something that you need to harp on and happen. You don't feel bad because it happened. I don't care whose ancestors did it, whatever. It's the reality. So therefore, we need to take that reality and recognize that is what we're fighting against, that intentionality. And then thirdly, I think you got to recognize that all of us have gifts or privileges that if we bring them to the same table,
we can have an awesome potluck.
We can have an awesome potluck. Or I say a great stew.
Yeah, I know.
Stew.
I've heard you say
exactly.
that before.
You like stew.
That's been one of the
metaphor.
best metaphors, right? Is the church is not called to be a melting pot. The church is called to have a pot full of beautiful stew.
Right.
Because there's difference in stew while still creating something that is better than any of those individual ingredients on their own.
Right.
So,
and a melting pot is guaranteed to create dividing walls.
Right.
Because everybody's fighting for their identity.
Right.
A stew pot highlights the identities and talk about their unity together.
That's right. That carrot is better because of the piece of beef in the stew. That's exactly right. Oh, that's exactly right. And, it is one of these where we have spent most of our time today talking more about relationship than we have about specific issues within this conversation. We've mentioned a few things along the way. Stan, some of your last answer there kind of leaned in there in good ways. But I think what I want to highlight as we close out here is that somebody might have that question, right? Well, why did I listen to this whole podcast about the hostile dividing walls between race and ethnicity? And mostly we just talked about relationship and friendship. Well, we're not saying that the issues don't matter. We're not saying that that there's not good reading to do, that there's not good research and learning in some of these conversations. They're very complex. But what we are saying, and what I hope we've modeled here today, is that the context for the healthiest conversations about the quote-unquote issues is genuine relationship. Mm-hmm. Yes, Dan.
And I would say this sort of as a closing piece.
Please, yeah.
God never called us to resolve Americans' problems. So if America's divided, if America's segregated, if America has hostility between political parties, all that kind of stuff, that's not what he's called us to do. He's called us to be the light in darkness. He called us to be salt whenever it needs to be flavored. And right now, so the only way we can do that is to be who God has called us to be in spite of that. Mm. So if it's that dark, we should be that much lighter. If it's that dark and we're not light, then we look like them. And so I think the argument is not how do we solve racism in America. That's not the question. The question is how do we be the church? Ephesians says this. It says, Christ has been put as head over all things to the church.
All things. And
then he says, and it is his body, and in that he will fulfill every nick and cranny of everything. He didn't say he's put over head of all things to the government, to America, not even to your neighborhood. It is to the church. And that's the vehicle that he's going to work through. And that's what we have to get fixed in our minds.
Yeah. Tom, any kind of closing thoughts?
It's really good.
Yeah.
The church does matter, doesn't it? And let's be the church.
The local church, as God designed it,
It's the hope of the world.
It's the hope of the world. Well, thank you, Tom. Thank you,
Great to be
Stan.
with you.
It was so great to be together and to hear more of the story. I love the shout out for Charles Usher. We're recording this in our downtown campus, still a part of Christ Community all these years later. Just so wonderful. So thanks to each of you for joining us today. This has been an important conversation, and I hope it did challenge you to think more deeply about the need for genuine relationships and the importance and really possibility of being able to do that in and through the church. So thanks for joining us. On our next episode, Pastor Bill Gorman is going to lead a conversation about gender relationships in the church and in the culture between men and women as leaders in the church, and the increased cultural tension that we've seen lately between egalitarians and complementarians. That will be with Tom Nelson again and Melody McSparron, a congregant in our Leawood campus and gifted theologian. If you are interested in what you heard here today, remember to come back and check out the show notes. Lots of details in there. Thanks so much for joining us on the theFormed.life podcast.